My swim coach saw me as easy prey, so I became the witness who ended his career. Coach Brennan called me into his office after practice and locked the door behind us with a soft click that made my stomach tighten. My name is Lily Faulkner, and I was 14 years old, standing in the cramped equipment room at Riverside Aquatic Center wearing my still damp practice suit and team jacket. He told me to sit on the metal folding chair while he pulled out my performance data from the last meet. My butterfly times had improved by 0.3 of a second, he said, running his finger down the spreadsheet. But my underwaters were still weak, and my turns needed work if I wanted to make junior nationals. He moved behind my chair and put his hands on my shoulders, fingers pressing into the bare skin above my collarbone. He said elite swimmers needed to understand their bodies completely, needed to trust their coaches to push them past normal limits. His thumbs moved in small circles against my neck, supposedly demonstrating muscle tension, but something about the way he breathed made my skin crawl. He said we'd be doing private sessions twice a week to work on technique, just the two of us when the pool was empty. I nodded because refusing your coach meant losing your spot on the travel team, and I'd worked 4 years to earn that spot. Everyone knew Coach Brennan produced champions. 3 of his swimmers had gone Division I, 2 had made Olympic trial cuts. Parents fought to get their kids into his advanced training group. The private sessions started the following week on Thursday evenings after the facility closed at 9. Mom worked late shifts at the hospital and Dad traveled for sales, so they were relieved Coach Brennan offered extra attention. They didn't question why the sessions had to be so late or why parents weren't allowed to watch. Elite training required focus, Coach Brennan had explained at the parent meeting. Distractions compromised performance. The other parents had nodded in agreement, grateful their children were receiving such dedicated coaching. That first session, he had me do underwater streamlines while he filmed with his phone to analyze my form. He made me repeat each set 5 times, adjusting my body position with his hands, fingers lingering on my ribs, my hips, the small of my back. He said muscle memory required repetition and correction, that champions let their coaches shape their bodies into perfect instruments. When I climbed out of the pool shivering, he wrapped a towel around me and pulled me close, supposedly to conserve body heat. His arms encircled me completely, pressing my wet body against his dry clothes. He said I was special, that he saw Olympic potential in me that my parents couldn't understand. That these private sessions would transform me from a good swimmer into a great one, but only if I trusted him completely. I pulled away and grabbed my bag, mumbling something about homework. He smiled and reminded me we had another session scheduled for Monday. I didn't want to go back, but skipping meant questions I couldn't answer. How could I explain that my coach made me uncomfortable without sounding dramatic or ungrateful? He hadn't actually done anything wrong that I could point to specifically. The touches were supposedly instructional. The filming was for technique analysis. The close physical contact was normal in coaching. I'd watched him work with other swimmers the same way during regular practice. But those sessions happened in public, with teammates and parents around. The private sessions felt different in ways I couldn't articulate. On Monday, I arrived at the pool hoping other swimmers would be there, but the parking lot was empty except for Coach Brennan's truck. He was waiting by the door, holding it open with that same smile that no longer felt friendly. We went through the same drill routine, but this time he had me remove my team jacket so he could see my shoulder alignment better. The pool area was cold and I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt in just my suit. He told me to stop being self-conscious, that elite swimmers couldn't afford modesty. He positioned me facing away from him and put his hands on my shoulders, supposedly checking symmetry, but his thumbs traced along the edge of my suit straps in a way that made my breath catch. He said tension in my upper back was affecting my catch, that he needed to do some manual therapy to release it. His hands moved lower, pressing into the muscles along my spine, fingers spreading wide across my ribcage. I froze, uncertain whether this was legitimate sports medicine or something else. He kept talking in that calm, coaching voice about fascia release and muscle engagement, making everything sound clinical and professional. But his hands were moving in patterns that didn't match any physical therapy I'd seen. I stepped forward quickly and said I needed to use the bathroom. He nodded and told me to hurry back. We had a lot of work to do. In the bathroom, I stared at my reflection and tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Coach Brennan was respected, experienced, trusted by dozens of families. My parents paid premium fees for his coaching. If something was actually wrong, other swimmers would have reported it, right? Other parents would have noticed. I splashed cold water on my face and went back to the pool, where Coach Brennan was adjusting the lane lines and acting completely normal. He had me do 25-meter sprints while he filmed, offering technical corrections that sounded legitimate. By the end of the session, I'd almost convinced myself the earlier discomfort was just my imagination. He said I was improving rapidly, and that these private sessions were clearly working. He'd see me Thursday. Thursday came too quickly. This time, when I climbed out after underwater drills, Coach Brennan said we needed to work on my streamline position on the deck. He had me lie face down on the pool deck while he straddled my legs, pressing down on my lower back to supposedly demonstrate proper core engagement. His weight pinned me to the cold concrete, his hands pushing my arms into position above my head. He was demonstrating something about spinal alignment, but all I could focus on was how trapped I felt, how vulnerable this position made me. He stayed like that for what felt like minutes, his breathing heavy from exertion, before finally standing up and offering his hand to help me up. He said my form was improving, but I needed to learn to trust him completely, to let him manipulate my body without resistance. Elite swimmers surrendered control to their coaches because coaches understood biomechanics better than athletes did. I nodded and said I needed to leave for a family dinner. He frowned and reminded me that commitment separated champions from mediocre swimmers. Did I want to be mediocre? I shook my head and promised I'd stay the full 2 hours next time. He smiled and said he knew I had what it took to be special. That night, I barely slept, replaying each session in my mind, trying to identify exactly what was wrong. Nothing he'd done was obviously inappropriate. He hadn't touched anywhere explicitly forbidden. He'd maintained the language of coaching throughout. But the accumulation of moments, the isolation, the increasing physical contact, all of it felt wrong in ways I couldn't prove. I thought about telling my parents, but what would I say? My coach makes me uncomfortable? They'd assume I was resistant to hard training, that I was making excuses to avoid the work required for elite performance. They'd already sacrificed so much for my swimming, driving me to early morning practices, paying for private coaching fees, rearranging their schedules around my meet calendar. How could I tell them I wanted to quit because of vague feelings of discomfort? On Monday, I told Coach Brennan I had too much homework to continue private sessions. He looked disappointed and said that was unfortunate timing. He'd just submitted my name for consideration for a national development camp. The selection committee wanted to see improvement in my technique before making their decision. If I wasn't willing to put in extra work, he'd have to recommend someone else. The camp was a huge opportunity, something I'd dreamed about since I started competitive swimming. I asked if we could do the private sessions with other swimmers present. He said the other girls weren't at my level and would slow down my progress. The sessions continued, each one pushing boundaries incrementally. He introduced massage therapy, supposedly to prevent injury and improve recovery. His hands worked up my calves, my thighs, higher than seemed necessary for swimming-related muscle groups. He explained that hip flexibility was crucial for breaststroke, and that he needed to assess my range of motion. He had me lie on my back while he lifted and rotated my legs, his face close to mine, his hands gripping my thighs. When I tensed up, he said champions learn to relax, to trust their coaches completely. He asked if I trusted him, and I said yes because saying no meant losing everything I'd worked for. He said trust was a two-way street, that I needed to show him I was committed to this partnership. He needed to know I wouldn't talk to my parents or teammates about our training methods because they wouldn't understand the level of dedication required for elite performance. People who weren't in the sport would sexualize what was purely professional. Could I keep our training sessions confidential? I nodded, and in that moment, I understood he knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't accidental or well-intentioned. He was grooming me systematically, using my Olympic dreams as leverage. Now, that realization should have made me stop attending the sessions, but I was 14 and terrified of losing my swimming career. Coach Brennan controlled everything, who made travel teams, who got recommended for camps and scholarships, who received attention during group practice. Refusing him meant social isolation from the team and the end of my competitive swimming. So I kept going to private sessions while trying to minimize the physical contact, always finding excuses to create distance, to cut sessions short, to avoid being completely alone with him. He noticed my resistance and responded by making veiled threats about my position on the team. During group practice, he'd ignore me completely or criticize my technique harshly in front of teammates. Then during private sessions, he'd be warm and supportive again, saying he pushed me hard in group because he knew I could handle it, that this was how champions were built. The manipulation was sophisticated and constant. He'd isolated me from my teammates by giving me special attention, making them jealous of the private coaching. Then he'd use that isolation against me, ensuring no one would believe me if I reported what was happening. He'd created the perfect trap. Everything changed in late October during an away meet in Columbus. Our team stayed at a hotel near the aquatic center, 2 swimmers per room, chaperones on each floor. After Saturday's preliminary races, Coach Brennan announced room assignments for study hall, where swimmers were supposed to work on homework together. He assigned me to his room alone, saying the other girls were too distracting, and I needed to focus on strategy for tomorrow's finals. I knew immediately this was different from the pool sessions, more dangerous because we'd be in a private space with a bed. I told him I'd left my homework at home and didn't need study hall. He said that was fine, we could watch race footage instead and work on visualization. My roommate, Amber, gave me a strange look as I followed Coach Brennan down the hallway to his room. Inside, he closed the door and gestured to the bed, telling me to sit while he pulled up video on his laptop. He sat next to me, close enough that our legs touched, and began analyzing my race footage. His hand rested on my thigh while he pointed out technical issues, his fingers drawing patterns on my skin. I tried to focus on the screen, on his words about stroke count and tempo, but all I could think about was how wrong this felt and how trapped I was. Coach Brennan paused the video and said we needed to talk about my resistance during private sessions. He'd invested a lot of time and energy in my development, more than any other swimmer, and he deserved better cooperation. He understood I was young and might not recognize how unique our coach-athlete bond was, but he needed me to understand that what we had was special. He put his hand on my face, tilting my chin up toward him and said, "You're not just another swimmer to me." The words hung between us, transforming everything that had happened over the past months from possible misunderstanding to confirmed predation. This wasn't about coaching or technique or Olympic potential. This had never been about swimming. Before he could move closer, someone knocked on the door. Coach Brennan pulled back quickly, his expression shifting to professional neutrality. He opened the door to find the meet coordinator asking about team schedules for tomorrow's warm-up. I used the interruption to grab my bag and slip out, mumbling about needing to get something from my room. I ran down the hallway and locked myself in the bathroom, hands shaking, stomach churning. For the first time, I understood the full scope of what had been happening and what Coach Brennan had been building toward. I couldn't tell my parents while we were still at the meet, not with Coach Brennan controlling the team and the situation. I avoided him completely for the rest of the weekend, staying with teammates constantly, never being alone anywhere he might find me. He watched me during warm-ups with an expression I couldn't read, something between disappointment and calculation. After my finals race, I finished 4th and qualified for regional championships. Coach Brennan congratulated me briefly in front of my parents, completely professional, giving no indication of what had happened in his hotel room. On the drive home, Mom asked if something was wrong between me and Coach Brennan. I'd seemed distant during the meet and he'd barely worked with me. I said everything was fine. I was just focused on racing. But I knew I couldn't continue swimming under him. The question was how to leave without destroying my competitive career or facing retaliation. That night, I researched reporting options online, reading stories from other athletes who'd reported coaches for inappropriate behavior. The pattern was consistent and terrifying. Athletes who reported were often not believed, forced to leave their teams, lost scholarship opportunities, and became pariahs in their sports community. Coaches were protected by parents who'd invested thousands in training fees, by club administrators who feared liability, and by a culture that prioritized winning over athlete safety. Monday's practice was torture. Coach Brennan acted completely normal during the main set, offering corrections and encouragement to the whole team. But when everyone else went to cool down, he called me over and asked why I'd been avoiding him at the meet. I said I hadn't been avoiding him, just focusing on my races. He said he could tell something had changed and he hoped I wasn't having second thoughts about our training arrangement. He reminded me that regional championships were in 6 weeks, and I needed private sessions to be competitive. When I didn't respond, his tone shifted. He said he'd hate to see me waste my potential because of teenage drama or misunderstandings. Did I understand what he meant? I nodded and he patted my shoulder, his hand lingering. After practice, Amber pulled me aside in the locker room and asked if Coach Brennan was bothering me. She'd noticed the private sessions and the way he singled me out. I wanted to tell her everything, but fear paralyzed me. What if she didn't believe me? What if she told her parents and they told mine and Coach Brennan found out? Instead, I said everything was fine and changed the subject. Amber looked unconvinced but didn't push. That night, I made a decision. I started documenting everything. I created a detailed timeline of every private session, every inappropriate comment, every boundary-crossing touch. I wrote down dates, times, specific details about what happened. I noted witnesses to anything that occurred during group practice. I saved every text message Coach Brennan had sent me about session schedules. I began recording our private sessions on my phone, hidden in my bag near the pool deck. The recordings captured his voice telling me to relax, to trust him, to stop being so tense. They captured the sounds of him moving closer, his breathing, his hands on my body described in his own words as he explained what he was supposedly doing. I didn't have a plan for how to use this evidence, but I understood instinctively that I needed documentation if anyone was ever going to believe me. The next private session, I kept my phone recording in my jacket pocket while Coach Brennan had me do the streamline drill on the deck. He straddled my legs again, but this time he bent lower, his chest against my back, his mouth near my ear as he described proper body position. His hands moved along my sides, supposedly checking alignment, but the recording would capture him breathing heavily, taking his time, his fingers tracing patterns that had nothing to do with swimming technique. When he finally let me up, I felt sick and violated, but I had evidence. The breaking point came 3 weeks later during what would be my final private session. Coach Brennan had me doing resistance training with elastic bands, a legitimate drill but one that required him to provide the counter resistance from behind me. He positioned himself against my back, arms wrapped around me, supposedly to hold the bands correctly, but the position was intimate and wrong. He said we'd been working together for months and he was proud of how far I'd come, both as a swimmer and as a person. He said he felt closer to me than any other athlete he'd coached. His hands slid from the resistance bands to my stomach, pulling me tighter against him. I froze completely, every muscle rigid, unable to speak or move. He must have felt my terror because he stopped and stepped back, asking if something was wrong. I grabbed my bag and ran from the pool area without answering, bursting through the exit door into the cold November night. I sat in my car shaking, knowing I couldn't go back, knowing everything was about to change. I drove home and walked directly into my parents' bedroom, where they were watching television before bed. I said I needed to tell them something about Coach Brennan, and it wasn't going to be easy to hear. My parents' initial reaction was exactly what I'd feared. Dad asked if I was sure I wasn't misinterpreting normal coaching behavior. Mom asked why I hadn't said something earlier if things were really inappropriate. They questioned whether I might be exaggerating because training was hard and I wanted an excuse to quit. Their doubt shattered me, but I'd prepared for it. I showed them my documented timeline, the text messages, and I played portions of the recordings. My voice on the recording saying, "Please stop," while Coach Brennan's voice continued explaining technique, telling me to relax, to trust him. The audio evidence changed their expressions from skeptical to horrified. Dad's face flushed red and he started pacing, asking why Coach Brennan thought he could touch his daughter that way. Mom wrapped her arms around me and apologized for not believing me immediately. She asked if he'd ever done anything more than what I'd described. I said no, but I knew he'd been building toward it systematically. Dad said we were going to the police immediately, and he was going to confront Coach Brennan himself. Mom stopped him, saying we needed to handle this properly through official channels to ensure Coach Brennan faced real consequences. She called her lawyer friend who specialized in family law. The lawyer arrived within an hour and listened to my whole story while taking detailed notes. The lawyer explained that reporting would trigger a complex process involving police investigation, club administration review, and potentially a criminal case depending on what evidence existed. She warned that I'd likely face retaliation from the swimming community, that other parents might not believe me or might prioritize their children's continued access to Coach Brennan's coaching over my safety. She said the process would be difficult and potentially traumatic, but that my documentation and recordings provided strong evidence of grooming and inappropriate conduct. She recommended we file a police report immediately and contact the USA Swimming Safe Sport Program, which handled abuse allegations in competitive swimming. That night, we went to the police station where I gave a statement to a detective who specialized in crimes against children. She was kind but thorough, asking questions that forced me to relive each uncomfortable session in explicit detail. She said my recordings and documentation were crucial evidence, but that building a criminal case required corroboration. Were there other victims? Other swimmers who might have experienced similar behavior from Coach Brennan? I said I didn't know, but suspected I wasn't the first. The detective said she'd investigate other complaints against him and review the club's records. In the meantime, I should have no contact with Coach Brennan and should not return to the pool. The investigation moved quickly once initiated. Within 3 days, police had interviewed 6 other current and former swimmers from Riverside Aquatics. 2 were willing to make formal statements about Coach Brennan's inappropriate behavior. One was my teammate Vanessa, who'd quit the team 6 months earlier after private sessions became too uncomfortable. She'd never reported what happened because her parents didn't believe her, and she'd felt too ashamed to push harder. Another was a college swimmer named Michaela, who'd trained under Coach Brennan 3 years ago. She'd experienced similar grooming and private session boundary violations, but had convinced herself it was normal coaching until she moved to a university team and realized other coaches didn't behave that way. 4 other swimmers confirmed Coach Brennan's pattern of isolating certain female athletes for private sessions and making them uncomfortable, but they hadn't experienced overtly sexual contact and weren't willing to make formal complaints. The detective said this pattern of behavior was typical for predatory coaches, escalating gradually with victims who seemed vulnerable while maintaining plausible deniability. She filed charges of gross sexual imposition and child endangerment. Coach Brennan was arrested at the pool during an afternoon practice session. The swimming community's response was immediate and divided. Some parents immediately pulled their children from Riverside Aquatics, horrified that a predator had been coaching their kids. Others defended Coach Brennan passionately, claiming the accusations were fabricated by difficult athletes who couldn't handle tough coaching. Several families whose daughters had received college scholarships through Coach Brennan's connections publicly stated their support for him, saying their daughters had never experienced anything inappropriate and that false accusations destroyed good coaches. The club's board of directors held an emergency meeting and placed Coach Brennan on administrative leave pending investigation. They hired an outside firm to conduct an independent review of all coaching practices and any previous complaints. The firm's report, released 6 weeks later, revealed that 3 parents had previously raised concerns about Coach Brennan's private sessions with female athletes. Each time, the club's executive director had addressed the concern by meeting with Coach Brennan, who'd explained the sessions were part of elite training protocols. The executive director had accepted those explanations without independent verification or follow-up with the concerned families. The report found systematic institutional failure to protect young athletes from a coach who'd been using his position to groom and abuse swimmers for at least 5 years. My life became unbearable. I couldn't return to the pool where I'd spent 6 years training, where all my friends and my entire social world existed. Parents who believed Coach Brennan sent their daughters to school with instructions not to speak to me. I received anonymous messages online calling me a liar and attention seeker who was destroying a good man's life. Someone created a fake social media account posting doctored photos of me with captions suggesting I'd been in a relationship with Coach Brennan and had fabricated abuse claims after being rejected. My parents reported the harassment to police, but tracking down anonymous accounts was difficult and time-consuming. During this nightmare, Vanessa and Michaela became unexpected allies. We'd formed a group text where we shared updates and supported each other through the investigation process. Vanessa's parents had finally believed her after my report validated her previous claims. Michaela was in her sophomore year of college and had spent 3 years blaming herself for what happened, believing she'd somehow invited Coach Brennan's behavior. Learning about the pattern of predation across multiple victims helped her understand she wasn't responsible. Together, the three of us provided prosecutors with a clear timeline of Coach Brennan's escalating behavior and consistent methods of grooming and manipulation. The preliminary hearing happened in late January. Coach Brennan appeared in court wearing a suit, looking respectable and hurt by the accusations. His attorney argued that the charges were based on misunderstandings by young athletes who'd been subjected to rigorous training and had interpreted normal coaching contact as something sinister. He presented letters from dozens of swimmers and parents attesting to Coach Brennan's character and professionalism. He argued that my recordings had been taken out of context and that competitive swimming required physical contact for technique correction. The prosecution presented expert testimony from sports psychologists about grooming patterns and from other coaches about appropriate boundaries in swimming instruction. They played excerpts from my recordings where Coach Brennan could be heard telling me to trust him, to keep our sessions confidential, to relax while his hands moved across my body. The judge found probable cause to proceed to trial on all charges. Coach Brennan was released on bail with conditions that he have no contact with minors and not coach any athletic programs. Outside the courthouse, his attorney gave a statement saying they looked forward to proving his innocence at trial. Inside the courtroom, Vanessa's mother broke down crying, apologizing for not believing her daughter sooner, for letting her quit swimming without investigating why. The media coverage was extensive and often re-traumatizing. Local news stations ran stories about the charges against a prominent youth swim coach, always careful to note he'd not been convicted and was presumed innocent. But they also interviewed parents about safety in youth sports and experts about warning signs of predatory behavior. National swimming publications covered the case because Coach Brennan had been well known in the sport, his swimmers consistently performing well at regional and national competitions. USA Swimming issued a statement saying Coach Brennan's membership had been suspended pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. The national governing body launched its own investigation into Riverside Aquatics safety protocols and found multiple violations of their athlete protection policies. The club's executive director resigned under pressure, and the entire board was replaced by parents demanding accountability. I testified at a USA Swimming hearing about my experiences, providing recommendations for policy changes that would better protect young athletes. The organization implemented several of my suggestions, including mandatory one-on-one coaching guidelines, requiring transparent scheduling of private sessions, and establishing independent reporting channels for athlete complaints. The trial began in late March. I testified for 3 hours about the progression of Coach Brennan's behavior, walking the jury through each private session, each inappropriate touch, each manipulation that had kept me silent. His attorney cross-examined me aggressively, suggesting I'd been a willing participant in extra coaching, that I'd never said no or asked him to stop, that I'd continued attending sessions voluntarily for months. I explained that saying no meant losing my swimming career, that Coach Brennan had systematically isolated me and made me believe I had no choice. The prosecutor played my recordings in full, letting the jury hear Coach Brennan's voice as he touched me, as he told me to relax and trust him, as he described what he was doing to my body in clinical language that couldn't hide the sexual undertone. Vanessa testified about similar experiences during her time with Coach Brennan. Michaela described how Coach Brennan had told her she was special and that their coaching relationship was unique, the same language he'd used with me. The pattern was undeniable and damning. The defense called character witnesses who testified about Coach Brennan's dedication to swimming and his athletes. They brought in a biomechanics expert who explained that physical contact was sometimes necessary for teaching proper technique. But under cross-examination, the expert admitted that the specific touches described by multiple victims went far beyond what was professionally appropriate. The prosecution's closing argument focused on the systematic nature of Coach Brennan's predation, how he'd selected vulnerable young athletes, isolated them, groomed them with special attention and opportunities, and progressively violated boundaries while maintaining plausible deniability. The defense argued that ambitious young swimmers had misinterpreted demanding coaching and were now destroying an innocent man's life and career. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges of gross sexual imposition and multiple counts of child endangerment. Coach Brennan showed no emotion as the verdicts were read. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. Outside the courthouse, my parents held me while I cried, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being believed and validated after months of doubt and victim blaming. Sentencing day brought more than 60 people to the courthouse. Survivors and their families sat on one side of the gallery. Coach Brennan's supporters sat on the other. The judge allowed victim impact statements before imposing sentence. I spoke first, reading from prepared remarks about how Coach Brennan's abuse had stolen my love of swimming, destroyed my ability to trust adults in authority, and left me with trauma that would require years of therapy to process. Vanessa described the shame and self-blame she'd carried for quitting swimming, believing she'd failed rather than understanding she'd been protecting herself from a predator. Michaela explained how Coach Brennan's abuse had affected her college swimming career and her relationships, how she'd struggled with anxiety and depression while believing herself responsible for what happened. The judge listened carefully to each statement. When we finished, he addressed Coach Brennan directly, saying he'd abused his position of trust to prey on vulnerable young athletes for his own gratification. He'd used their Olympic dreams as weapons against them, manipulating their dedication to sport into opportunities for exploitation. The judge sentenced Coach Brennan to 12 years in prison on multiple counts, to run consecutively. He'd serve a minimum of 8 years before parole eligibility. USA Swimming permanently banned Coach Brennan from all sanctioned activities. Riverside Aquatics closed permanently, unable to recover from the scandal and liability costs. Several families filed civil lawsuits against the club and its former administrators for failing to protect their children. I never returned to competitive swimming. The pool had become too associated with trauma, and I couldn't find a path back to the joy I'd once felt in the water. Instead, I channeled my energy into advocacy, working with SafeSport and other organizations to improve athlete protection policies in youth sports. I testified before state legislative committees about the need for stronger background check requirements and mandatory reporting standards for youth coaches. I helped develop training programs for parents about recognizing warning signs of grooming and abuse. Vanessa eventually returned to swimming at a different club with a female coach, rediscovering her love for the sport in an environment that prioritized safety over medals. Michaela graduated college and became a sports psychologist, specializing in treating athletes who'd experienced abuse. 5 years after Coach Brennan's conviction, I stood before a room of youth swimming coaches delivering mandatory safe sport training. I told my story not to dwell on victimhood, but to illustrate how predators operated, how institutional failures enabled abuse, and how every coach in that room had a responsibility to protect young athletes. Some coaches looked uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing their own boundary violations in my descriptions of Coach Brennan's behavior. Others took notes and asked thoughtful questions about creating safer training environments. After the presentation, 3 coaches approached me privately. Each described concerns they had about colleagues at their clubs, behaviors that seemed inappropriate but that they'd hesitated to report. I connected them with SafeSport investigators and encouraged them to trust their instincts. Protecting young athletes required collective vigilance and willingness to act on uncomfortable suspicions. Coach Brennan served 8 years before being released on parole at age 52, his swimming career destroyed, his reputation permanently tainted, facing lifetime registration as a sex offender. The witness who ended his career became the advocate who changed youth swimming culture, transforming personal trauma into systematic protection for thousands of young athletes who would never know the predator I'd helped stop. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.